This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 601st episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Is your story too complicated? Here are 9 signs. Calling a story complex is a high compliment. But what is complexity? How can we learn to write stories that are complex without skidding across that narrow dividing line into complicated? What's the difference between a complex story and a complicated story? This is a topic I've spent quite some time contemplating in recent years, not least because one of the major reasons my fantasy work in progress went off the rails was my realization in revisions that it was just too complicated. A few weeks ago, in the episode entitled How to Structure Stories with Multiple Characters, I mentioned in passing that one of the most powerful guidelines for any author is to honor simplicity. This doesn't mean you can't write stories of deep complexity, but it does mean you should never confuse complex with complicated. This comment sparked a conversation in the comments of the transcript of that episode on my website, in which Lila Diller asked, could you define more clearly what you mean about the difference between complex and complicated? And so, an episode, or 2 episodes actually, was born. Today, I want to talk about several of the most common culprits for complicated stories. Next week, we'll talk about how you can bring desired complexity into your work in progress. So first off, what's the difference between complex and complicated? As I mentioned in my original response to Lila's question, I like to think of complex as many streams all leading to the sea. Meanwhile, complicated is more akin to many streams leading to many different seas. Both are the result of many parts, but complexity brings unity to the overall whole by connecting more of those parts, while a complicated story is one in which those many parts don't quite come together to create a single effect. Now, there are many different ways we can complicate our stories, but today I want to talk about 9 examples of complicated stories that come to my mind. Example number 1, a plot in which the structural beats are all about different things. Now, ideally, your story's structural through line, as revealed by its major structural beats, will show continuity. Even if your story is vast and sprawling with a large cast, the structural through line should be cohesive and focused. You don't want to see the first plot point focusing on the conflict with the antagonist, the midpoint focusing on a relationship subplot, and the third plot point veering away to put the spotlight on a supporting character. For example, Iron Man 3 offers an example of a story that overcomplicates itself because its structural beats aren't all focusing on the main plot. Example number 2, a story featuring varied themes that don't support each other. Now, theme is often one of the most complex aspects of a story. It offers the opportunity to add layers of depth and interest to an exploration of any single topic. However, to create a unified effect, all the sub-themes should support a single overarching thematic principle. The easiest way to identify your story's primary thematic principle is to examine your protagonist's character arc. Look at the thematic lie and truth he will be interacting with throughout the story, and especially in the climactic moment. You don't want your supporting characters' arcs to focus on unrelated themes. For example, complications are likely to arise if your protagonist's story is about seeking justice, while your antagonist's story is about dealing with a midlife crisis, and the love interest's focus is on getting out of debt. For example, The Last Jedi was scattered in its structural throughline, and as a result lacked any cohesive thematic emergence from amongst its many subplots. Example number 3, a setting that is scattered or unfocused. Although not the most egregious offender, a scattered sense of setting can exacerbate the feeling that a story is complicated. A tight control of setting, with an eye on thematic intent, will benefit any story. Even in stories that intentionally cover a lot of ground, you'll want a unifying factor, a pertinent reason why the characters are in these settings. For example, setting hopping stories such as those in the James Bond and Mission Impossible franchises are in fact built around the idea of an international setting, which makes it all seem much less random than if, say, Elizabeth Bennet decided to take a quick vacation to Lisbon. Now, Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens offers a notorious example of a random and unnecessary setting thanks to a lengthy section in which the author shoehorned his title character into a grueling tour of the United States. Example number 4. A story featuring too many characters filling the same type of role. So one of the easiest ways to complicate a story is by adding unnecessary characters. And this is especially true when you have multiple characters performing essentially the same role in a story. For instance, ask yourself, how many friends does your protagonist have? If there are several, do they really all play a fundamentally different role within the story? Or are friends number 2 and 3 just adding noise, aka complications? Particularly, examine how many antagonists your story offers. Although multiple antagonists can in fact add complexity, as we'll talk about next week, they can also unnecessarily complicate a story. Look at your climax. The characters who are important in the climax are the characters who are important to the story. This doesn't mean you have to axe everyone else, but this understanding will give you an idea of which characters may, in fact, be extraneous. For example, Spider-Man 3 notoriously sunk itself under the complicating deadweight of 3 major antagonists when it would have done much better to have given due diligence to just one. Example number 5. A character who is trying to form goals based on too many motivations. Now, we want to write complex characters whose motivations are equally multifaceted. But when the protagonist's reasons for wanting to kill the antagonist are based on the fact that the bad guy killed her boyfriend and on the fact that she had a bad experience with a serial killer when she was 9 and on the fact that the antagonist reminds her of the bully she hated in high school, it can all start feeling a bit convoluted and overdone. For example, I found the motivations of characters in the adaptation of The Witcher to be scattered and unconvincing. Yennefer, in particular, went from a motivation based on a tight and convincing backstory to having more motivations than I could count. She suffered physically, was bullied, rejected by her stepfather, oppressed for her elven blood, robbed of her ability to have children, all of which were primary motivations at different times. Example number 6. A magic system influenced by multiple metaphors. Now, this one is obviously going to be pertinent only to speculative fiction such as sci-fi and fantasy, but it's an important one. One thing most of the best fantasy stories have in common is a cohesive magic system. This doesn't necessarily mean it has to be as high concept as, say, Brandon Sanderson's Allomancy in Mistborn, in which different types of metal grant different types of magical powers. But particularly since you will have to explain the details of a magic system to readers, you don't want to overcomplicate its basic physics. The late Blake Snyder called this double mumbo jumbo. Basically, if the main metaphor for your magic system is weather, you don't want magic users also drawing power from runes or ghosts or some such. C.R. Rowanson offers an excellent system for creating cohesive magic systems of all types in his book, The Magic Blueprint System. Example number 7, a story with tonal whiplash. A story's tone will set up much of your reader's experience. If that tone jerks all over the place, it can quickly give them whiplash. This is a problem in its own right, but it can also make an already problematic story feel even more complicated. Now, this isn't to say a dark story can't offer moments of tenderness or humor, or that a light story can't occasionally break your heart. But the tone itself should remain consistent in telling readers what this story is about. For example, Baz Luhrmann's Australia opens as if it is a lighthearted romantic comedy, gets viewers settled into that, and then takes several 90-degree turns into totally new tonal directions, which is not so much a cause as a symptom of its complicated plot. Example number 8, a story with disorganized POVs. Common sense tells us that the fewer POVs a story features, the less complicated it will be. And yet, common sense also tells us that adding POVs, and even plot lines, can be a good way to add complexity. So, which is it? It all depends on how the author manages those POVs. Random POVs, which can be caused by narratives that head hop, narrators introduced late in the story, or narrators who are utilized for only a single scene, will often contribute to a more ragged feel for the overall narrative. On the other hand, a controlled use of POV, in which narrators are carefully chosen not just for their viewpoint, but for their thematic importance, and in which transitions are thoughtfully timed with respect to the overall structure and shape of the story, can create an organized feel in even the most complex stories. And example number 9, a story featuring plot lines or characters who don't come together in the end. So finally, we have what is probably the worst offender to the charge of a complicated story. Many of the previously mentioned complications won't necessarily sink a story all on their own, and audiences will often hold their patience until the end and forgive any loose ends if the finale satisfies them. If, however, your story's multiple plot lines and/or many characters do not all come together in the end in a way that feels satisfying, that's a clear sign you were trying to juggle too many balls and couldn't catch them all in the end. If you find that either you can't tie off all your loose ends by the climax, and/or that the only way to do so is to cop to coincidences and contrivances, you'll want to pull back and examine some of the previous points in this list to see where maybe you can trim out elements that aren't contributing to the bottom line. For example, Jupiter Ascending was full of lots of interesting plot lines and teasers, almost none of which were pertinent to the ending, or in some cases even explained. Now, there are, of course, many other ways a story can complicate itself, but this list is a good place to start. The main difference between a story that is complicated and one that is complex is simply that the complicated story doesn't work, and the complex one does because it is able to bring all its pieces together into a seamless finale that makes sense. So stay tuned. Next week, we will look at how to successfully deepen your story with desirable complexity. And in the meantime, I hope you will stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Can you think of any more ways in which a story may complicate itself unnecessarily? If you'd like to be part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.